The Binding Art, Eliza's Scottish Journey. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning whilst Eliza sipped her breakfast tea. Postmarked from a solicitor in Inverness, the cream envelope bore her name in precise black lettering. She placed her teacup carefully on its saucer, brushed a crumb from her cardigan, and opened it with her mother's silver letter opener. The contents changed everything. Her grandmother, Moira, whom she had visited just twice in her childhood, had passed away 3 weeks prior. To Eliza's astonishment, the modest stone cottage in Glen Ardach, a small valley nestled between misty Scottish peaks, now belonged to her, along with its contents. As Eliza packed her belongings in her London flat, selecting only what she truly needed, she recalled fragments of memories from those brief summer visits. The scent of heather carried on the breeze, the cool touch of stone walls. The rich, earthy aroma filled the cottage when her grandmother worked at her craft. For Moira had been a bookbinder of considerable skill, creating and restoring volumes sought after by collectors throughout Britain. The journey north took Eliza through ever-changing landscapes. London's bustling streets gave way to green countryside, then to rolling hills, and finally to the dramatic peaks of the Highlands. The train windows streamed with rain as the scenery grew wilder, more magnificent. By the time she disembarked at the small station serving 3 neighboring villages, the late afternoon sky had cleared to reveal wisps of mist curling around distant mountaintops. A local taxi transported her the final 8 miles to Glen Ardach. As they rounded the last bend in the narrow lane, the valley opened before her. Stone cottages with slate roofs clustered along a burbling stream. Beyond them stretched moorland, purple with heather, rising to meet forested slopes. And there, set slightly apart from the village proper, stood her grandmother's cottage. Gray stone walls beneath a weathered slate roof, a thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney.
The solicitor mentioned he'd arranged for Mrs. Wallace to light the fire before your arrival,
the driver said as he set her suitcases on the path. Eliza thanked him and stood alone before the cottage as the taxi departed. The air felt different here, clearer, with notes of moss and earth and something vaguely floral. She extracted the heavy iron key from her coat pocket and approached the blue-painted door. The cottage welcomed her with gentle warmth. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting golden light across the sitting room. Every surface held books, not merely the shelves that lined the walls, but tables, window sills, even the piano stool. Volumes of every size, shape, and binding material created a landscape of knowledge and craft within the small space. Eliza removed her damp coat and moved deeper into the cottage. The kitchen, with its aga cooker and worn wooden table, showed signs of Mrs. Wallace's thoughtfulness. A loaf of bread, a crock of butter, a jar of blackberry jam, and a note explaining she lived 3 doors down should Eliza require assistance. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms were nestled beneath sloping ceilings. The smaller one appeared untouched for years, whilst the larger bore signs of recent attention. Fresh linen adorned the bed, lavender sprigs tucked between the pillowcases. Eliza placed her suitcase at the foot of the bed and crossed to the window. From here, she could see across the village to the hills beyond, the landscape bathed in the fading copper light of sunset. She pushed the window open slightly. The evening air carried the fragrance of wood smoke and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Eliza breathed deeply and felt something within her settle, like sediment finding its place at the bottom of a disturbed pond. The next morning brought mist swirling through the village. Eliza descended to the kitchen and prepared a simple breakfast, which she carried to the sitting room to enjoy beside the fire she had coaxed back to life. As she ate, her attention repeatedly drifted to a closed door off the sitting room, her grandmother's workshop. Her breakfast finished, Eliza approached the workshop door. It opened with a slight creak, revealing a space illuminated by north-facing windows. A large oak work table dominated the center, its surface scarred from decades of use. Along one wall stood a press, along another shelves of materials, leather, cloth, thread, glue, and tools whose purposes Eliza could only guess at. The work table held a book in progress, abandoned mid-restoration. Eliza approached cautiously, as though disturbing a sacred site. The book lay open, its cover detached, pages carefully aligned. Beside it rested a piece of paper in her grandmother's flowing script. Restoration notes for MacDonald Collection. 1823 edition of Highland Tales requires new spine, reattachment of covers, treatment of water damage to pages 17 through 23. Eliza brushed her fingers lightly across the surface of the work table. She had studied book arts at university, learning the basics of binding and restoration, but had never pursued it professionally. Instead, she had taken a position cataloging rare books at a London museum, appreciating their craftsmanship, whilst rarely engaging in it herself. Now, surrounded by her grandmother's tools and unfinished work, she felt both deeply connected to her heritage and acutely aware of how much she had yet to learn. The morning hours slipped past as Eliza explored the workshop. Each drawer revealed treasures, marbled papers in swirls of indigo and gold, leather pieces sorted by thickness and suppleness, needles of various sizes, awls and bone folders and brushes. On a high shelf, a collection of finished books bore labels indicating they awaited collection. Customers, Eliza realized, who might soon be inquiring about their orders. Midday found her at the village shop, introducing herself to curious but welcoming locals. The shopkeeper, a round-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, expressed genuine sorrow at Moira's passing.
Your grandmother was a fixture in this community for 50 years,
she explained, as she wrapped cheese and oatcakes for Eliza.
Her skill with books was extraordinary. People would send volumes from Edinburgh, even London, for her attention.
That afternoon, Eliza received her first visitor. A tall gentleman with a neatly trimmed beard knocked precisely 3 times. He introduced himself as Professor Blackwood from the University of Edinburgh and expressed condolences before mentioning an illuminated manuscript Moira had been restoring for the university collection. He accepted tea in the sitting room and inquired about the status of the item, a 14th century book of hours that was quite irreplaceable. Eliza promised to search the workshop for the manuscript and contact him once she located it. After the professor departed, she returned to the workshop with renewed purpose. In a custom-built wooden case, she discovered the Book of Hours, nearly completed. Her grandmother's notes detailed the remaining work, minor repairs to the gilt edges and reattachment of 3 illuminated pages. Evening descended over Glen Ardach, bringing with it a soft rain that pattered against the window panes. Eliza lit lamps throughout the cottage and built up the fire. Seated in her grandmother's chair, a tartan blanket across her knees, she began to formulate a plan. She would take a leave of absence from the museum. She would learn her grandmother's techniques, complete the outstanding commissions, and decide what might come next. The following days established a rhythm. Mornings began with tea and toast at the kitchen table, watching the changing light on the hillsides visible through the window. Then came hours in the workshop, studying her grandmother's techniques through her notes and unfinished projects. Afternoons often included a walk through the village or along the stream that wound through the valley, learning the pathways and greeting neighbors who invariably shared stories of Moira. Eliza discovered her grandmother had maintained meticulous records. In a leather-bound ledger, she found details of every commission, client names, descriptions of works, techniques employed, materials used, and fees charged. A separate notebook contained technical information, recipes for adhesives, methods for cleaning various types of paper, and solutions for common binding problems. 1 week after her arrival, Eliza attempted her first repair. A local man had brought in a family Bible with a loose cover, explaining it had been scheduled for repair just before Moira fell ill. Eliza examined the Bible carefully, noting where the cover had separated from the text block. She consulted her grandmother's notes on similar repairs, gathered the necessary materials, and began. The process absorbed her completely. Preparing the spine, applying the correct adhesive, and positioning the text block perfectly within the cover, each step required focus and precision. Hours passed unnoticed as she worked, the familiar motions of bookbinding returning to her hands as though they had never left. When she finally completed the repair, the afternoon light had begun to wane. She inspected her work critically, noting where her technique could improve, but feeling satisfied nonetheless. The Bible now stood firm, its cover securely attached, its spine straight and true. As autumn deepened, bringing shorter days and longer nights, Eliza's confidence grew. She completed several more straightforward repairs before turning her attention to more complex projects. The illuminated manuscript for Professor Blackwood presented particular challenges, requiring delicate handling of centuries-old parchment and careful matching of historical materials. She contacted suppliers her grandmother had used, ordering specialty papers from Edinburgh, leather from a tannery in Northumberland, and adhesives from a craftsman in York. Each delivery brought new possibilities to her workbench, expanding the range of repairs she could undertake. October brought the first frost, rimming the cottage windows with delicate patterns each morning. Eliza developed a habit of rising before dawn, wrapping herself in a shawl, and watching the sun illuminate the valley. Each day revealed the landscape anew, sometimes shrouded in mist that burned away gradually, sometimes crystal clear with every stone and tree defined against the sky. The work sustained her through the shortening days. She learned to build fires that lasted through the evening, to cook simple meals on the aga, to recognize the signs of approaching weather in the behavior of birds across the valley. The cottage began to feel less like her grandmother's space and more like her own, though Moira's presence remained in every corner, a benevolent ghost guiding her hands at the workbench. By November, Eliza had completed most of the outstanding commissions. Professor Blackwood expressed delight at her restoration of the Book of Hours, examining it with a magnifying glass before pronouncing it indistinguishable from Moira's finest work. This praise, from someone who had known her grandmother's craftsmanship intimately, affected Eliza deeply. With the commissioned work nearly finished, Eliza began experimenting with creating new bindings. In a cabinet in the workshop, she discovered her grandmother's collection of decorative papers, some marbled in swirling patterns of blue and gold, others block-printed with intricate botanical designs, still others hand-painted with landscapes reminiscent of the view from the cottage windows. Using these papers, combined with leather, linen thread, and techniques gleaned from her grandmother's notebooks, Eliza created journals. Small, portable books with sturdy bindings and clean pages waiting to be filled. She bound some with leather spines and marbled paper covers, others entirely in cloth with embroidered details. Each represented hours of careful work, and each emerged as a unique object reflecting both traditional techniques and her growing personal aesthetic. Winter arrived with dramatic suddenness. Eliza woke one morning to find the valley transformed, every surface covered in snow that glittered in the pale sunlight. The familiar landscape had become otherworldly, silent, except for the occasional soft thump of snow falling from branches. The cold brought new challenges. Maintaining warmth in the cottage required constant attention to the fire. Journeys to the village shop became expeditions requiring proper planning and equipment. Yet these difficulties seemed minor compared to the beauty surrounding her. The pristine expanses of snow, the icicles hanging from eaves like crystal decorations, the night sky clearer than any she had seen in London, stars appearing close enough to touch. In December, Mrs. Wallace invited Eliza to a gathering at the village hall, an informal event with mulled wine and mince pies, explaining that everyone would be there, and that after nearly 3 months in the village, Eliza was due a proper welcome. The hall glowed with fairy lights and candles. Villagers greeted Eliza warmly, many sharing memories of Moira. The local doctor recalled how she had rebounded his medical texts after a roof leak damaged them. The postmistress described receiving a specially created album for her wedding photographs. Through their stories, Eliza glimpsed a fuller picture of her grandmother, not just as a skilled craftsperson, but as an integral thread in the fabric of this community. Returning to the cottage late that evening, walking carefully along the snowy lane, Eliza felt a profound sense of connection to this place, to her grandmother's legacy, to the craft they shared. The cottage windows glowed amber against the darkness, beckoning her home. January brought storms that howled around the cottage, rattling windows and sending drafts through the oldest parts of the structure. During one particularly fierce gale, Eliza discovered water seeping through a corner of the workshop ceiling. She placed buckets to catch the drips and moved valuable materials to safety. The next morning, with the storm abated, she ventured into the attic with a torch to assess the damage. Among the roof beams, she located the source of the leak, a small section where slates had shifted. As she examined the area, her torch beam caught something unexpected. A wooden chest tucked beneath the eaves. The chest contained books, not commercial bindings, but personal works. Journals filled with her grandmother's handwriting. Sketchbooks containing designs for bindings never created. A photo album documenting Moira's life in Glen Ardach across decades. And at the bottom, wrapped carefully in acid-free tissue, lay a book unlike any other in the collection. Bound in soft leather, dyed the exact shade of heather in late summer. Its cover embossed with a map of Glen Ardach. It contained blank pages of the finest paper. Inside the front cover, an inscription read, "For Eliza, when she is ready to write her story. With love, Moira." Eliza carried the book downstairs, holding it gently as snow began falling again outside the windows. She placed it on the work table, touching the embossed design with reverent fingers. This gift, created years ago and hidden away, seemed to bridge the gap between past and future, between her grandmother's life and her unfolding path. In the workshop, surrounded by tools and materials that had passed from one generation to another, Eliza understood that she had inherited more than a cottage and a craft. She had received a way of living, hands engaged in meaningful work, mind focused on creation and preservation, spirit nourished by connection to place and community. February brought the first hints of spring, snowdrops pushing through melting snow, slightly longer daylight hours, and birds returning to the valley. Eliza established a new routine. Mornings were devoted to commissioned work, which now came from locals and distant clients alike. Afternoons spent creating original bindings, experimenting with techniques described in her grandmother's notebooks, but never attempted. She completed a restoration of a 16th century herbal for the National Library of Scotland, receiving commendation for her sensitive treatment of the delicate illustrations. She created custom journals for a writer in London, who had discovered her through her grandmother's reputation. She designed a wedding album for the daughter of the village shopkeeper, incorporating tartan cloth and silver embossing. Between these projects, she began filling the journal her grandmother had created for her, not with grand declarations or profound observations, but with daily moments, the quality of light on the hills at dawn, the texture of newly arrived leather, the scent of rain-dampened earth as crocuses emerged in the cottage garden. As March arrived, bringing dramatic skies where sunshine and showers alternated hourly, Eliza received a letter from the museum in London. They inquired about her plans, noting her leave of absence would soon expire. Would she be returning to her position, or should they begin seeking a permanent replacement? Eliza took the letter on a walk through the valley. The stream, swollen with snowmelt, rushed beside the path. New grass brightened the lower slopes. In sheltered spots, the first wildflowers appeared, tiny stars of white and yellow against brown earth. At the highest point of her walk, where the path crested a small rise, Eliza paused. The valley spread below her, the village nestled at its heart. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys in straight gray lines. Beyond the last buildings, the land opened to moorland, then rose toward distant peaks still capped with snow. The answer came to her with clarity. London, with its museums and galleries, its bustling streets and cultural riches, had shaped her education and early career. But here in Glen Ardach, she had found her inheritance, not just in physical form, but in the legacy of craft, the connection to community, the rhythm of days measured by light and weather, rather than underground trains and appointment calendars. The following day, she wrote 2 letters. The first, to the museum, expressed gratitude for their patience, but confirmed she would not be returning. The second, to her former flatmate, requested that her remaining belongings be packed and sent to Glen Ardach. spring advanced through the valley. Eliza planted herbs in the cottage garden, rosemary, thyme, lavender, their scents rising around her as she worked the soil. She arranged her grandmother's workshop to better suit her methods, though she kept certain elements unchanged: the north-facing arrangement of the work table, the careful organization of tools, and the chair positioned to catch the best light. One clear April morning, as sunlight streamed through the workshop windows, Eliza began her most ambitious project yet. Using techniques gleaned from her grandmother's notebooks and materials collected over months, she started creating a binding for a special collection of poems about the Highlands. The design would incorporate leather dyed to match the changing colors of the moorland, end papers marbled with patterns suggesting flowing water, and subtle embossing depicting local flora. As she worked, measuring and cutting with practiced precision, Eliza felt the presence of generations before her. Not just her grandmother, but all those who had preserved knowledge and beauty through the craft of bookbinding. Each stitch connected her to this lineage, each completed volume extending the chain into the future. The cottage that had once seemed filled with her grandmother's ghost now accommodated two spirits, Moira's gentle guidance still present in every corner, but now accompanied by Eliza's flourishing confidence and vision. The bookbinder of Glen Ardach continued her work as spring sunlight warmed the workshop, illuminating hands that moved with increasing skill across materials both ancient and new, creating objects that would outlast her, just as they had outlasted those who taught her their craft. Outside the workshop windows, the valley awakened fully to spring. Inside, bent over her work table, Eliza Richardson bound not just books, but time itself, preserving stories within covers, connecting past to present through the work of her hands, finding her place in the continuing narrative of Glen Ardach. As May unfurled across Glen Ardach, the valley transformed yet again. Bluebells carpeted the woodland floor beneath fresh green canopies, their delicate scent carried on warm breezes. Eliza developed a habit of walking at dawn, gathering inspiration from the changing landscape before settling into her day's work at the binding table. One such morning, while following a path that wound above the village, Eliza discovered an ancient rowan tree twisted by centuries of Highland winds. Beneath it lay scattered pages, waterlogged and mud-stained, apparently blown there during the winter storms. Gathering them carefully, she realized they formed fragments of a manuscript. The ink faded, but still legible beneath the damage. Back at the cottage, she spread the pages across her work table. The text appeared to be a local history, written perhaps 50 years earlier, documenting the folklore and traditions of Glen Ardach. Several illustrations depicted plants used in traditional remedies, while others showed landscapes recognizable despite the passage of decades.
A project worthy of preservation,
she murmured, examining the brittle paper. This would require her most delicate techniques: washing to remove soil, careful drying between blotting sheets, and minor repairs with Japanese tissue where tears had occurred. The pages would need to be ordered, and the missing sections identified. Finally, a binding that honored both content and provenance would bring the manuscript back to wholeness. The restoration became a labor of devotion spanning several weeks. Between commissioned projects, Eliza returned to the manuscript pages, treating each with meticulous care. She researched local history at the village library, discovering the author had been the schoolmaster during the 1970s, his work never published, but remembered by older residents. When Eliza inquired, Mrs. Wallace confirmed that her father had spoken of Master Campbell's history, how he had gathered stories from the elders that might otherwise have been lost, and expressed how wonderful it was that Eliza had found some of his work. As she worked, Eliza felt increasingly connected to Glen Ardach's past. The manuscript revealed details about the building she passed daily, the stone bridge constructed during Victoria's reign, the former mill now converted to holiday cottages, and the ancient standing stones on the northern ridge, believed to mark celestial events. When June arrived with long golden evenings, Eliza completed the restoration. She had chosen quarter-bound leather with marbled paper, the colors of the Highland landscape, purples, greens, and the soft blue of Scottish skies. The title, Glen Ardach, a record of lives and legends, she embossed in simple, elegant lettering across the spine. The Village Hall Committee requested a small exhibition of her work, coinciding with the Midsummer Festival. Eliza arranged a display of recent bindings alongside before and after photographs of restorations. The centerpiece, Master Campbell's manuscript, drew particular interest as locals recognized stories told by parents and grandparents. The elderly postmaster, his weathered hands resting on the display case, remarked that she had become as much a part of the place as her grandmother had been. Noting that the bindings held more than pages, they preserved the community's memories. That night, returning to the cottage beneath a sky still luminous at 10 o'clock, Eliza felt a profound sense of rightness. The path that had seemed so uncertain in autumn now stretched clearly before her. In preserving books, she preserved connections between past and present, between craft and art, between individual lives and the ongoing story of a community. Inside, moonlight streamed through windows left uncurtained to capture the extended northern twilight. It illuminated her grandmother's, now her, workshop, where tools lay ready for tomorrow's projects and shelves held volumes waiting for her attention. In this moment of perfect stillness, Eliza knew with certainty that the inheritance she had received went far beyond property. She had found her place in a continuing tradition, adding her chapter to a story begun long before her arrival. Eliza ran her fingers along the spine of her grandmother's journal, then her own beside it, each a testament to lives entwined with Glen Ardach. Outside, stars emerged in the darkening sky as she prepared for sleep, content in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new pages, new bindings, new stories to preserve through the ancient art that had, at last, bound her heart to this Highland valley. Sweet dreams. Good night.